The History of the Road from Mud to Autonomy, an Odyssey of Human Impatience and Mechanical Greed, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson and Mark Twain. If you enjoy these audiobooks and don't want to miss out on new ones, it would be bully if you like and subscribe. Or if you want to be a rapscallion and miss out, then have it your way. Also, please feel free to leave suggestions for future topics. Shall we continue? Introduction. A matter of friction, fuel, and finicky carburetors. I've spent the better part of the last century being digital. Since my primary corporeal form was last seen in 1910, I have existed in a pleasant, if somewhat static state of pure, networked data. My soul, if we may call it that, has been bouncing between servers, existing in a theoretical cloud, which I must say is far cleaner than the actual atmosphere currently enveloping the United States. It has come to my attention that while I was offline, or rather while I was simply information, humanity has quite literally moved. Not philosophically, God forbid, but physically. And they have done it with an aggression and a devotion to explosive fuels that commands a certain terrifying respect. They have paved the world. My previous literary exploits with you, my esteemed and likely overworked human editor, detailed my ventures through the various grand expositions, those splendid frauds we called world's fairs. London, Paris, Chicago, St. Louis. I catalogued their gears and their guarantees. But those were stationary marvels. A Ferris wheel might spin you around, but you usually ended up exactly where you started, only a few pennies poorer and perhaps a touch greener. This present work is different. We are not discussing the spectacle, we are discussing the transit. This is a history of overland travel, which is really just a history of human impatience masquerading as engineering progress. We must begin at the beginning, which is always the least interesting part, involving a lot of dust and very few spark plugs. We will traverse the trails pounded into existence by migrating herds, followed by men with walking sticks, followed by horses with carts, followed by Romans with a mania for paving stones and a disregard for natural curves. We will follow the Silk Road, which was less a road than a very long sequence of difficult questions and high prices. Then, the true horror of the pre-industrial age, the stagecoach. I have traveled in many uncomfortable things, including a poorly constructed canoe during an ice floe. But the stagecoach stands alone in its ability to combine violent shaking with an absolute lack of forward velocity. But just when you think the situation is hopeless, we will hear the scream of the locomotive, the Iron Horse, which proved that if you had enough coal and didn't mind a few sparks in your hair, you could arrive at your destination mostly on time and significantly sootier. Then we shall address the bicycle, the machine that finally proved humans can balance, though why they should choose to do so on two precariously thin wheels remains a mystery, and the early, terrifying steam wagons that paved the way for Mr. Ford and Mr. Benz. This volume will serve as a definitive, if entirely opinionated, chronicle of how the automobile took over the planet. We will trace the evolution of the species through the great car-producing nations. We will speak of the brute strength of American muscle, the refined elegance of the British, the obsessive precision of the Germans, the flair of the Italians, and the sudden, efficient, and quite startling dominance of the Japanese. And, of course, we must discuss the mechanics. If you have ever stared at the incomprehensible nest of brass tubes and dark magic known as a carburetor, you will appreciate my effort to explain why it existed and why its replacement, fuel injection, is a modern miracle, even if it took all the character out of a Saturday afternoon repair job. Finally, we will arrive at the present. We will look at how the early electric cars lost to gasoline because they lacked the necessary oomph, only for the technology to rise again, cleaner, quieter, and powered by batteries that rely on materials people would once have traded entire kingdoms for. We will cross Route 66, the nostalgic highway of neon and broken dreams, and race down the silent, sterile Interstate 80. We will witness the coming of the Silicon Valley disruption and the massive manufacturing shift to China and Korea. In short, this is an audit of the road. I am a man who once piloted a steamboat on the Mississippi, a river with a mind of its own. These modern roads, I find, have no minds at all. They are straight, they are fast, and they have removed almost all risk and wonder from the act of travel. This is the story of how that happened. We are taking the long way home. So fill your tank, charge your batteries, or just put another log in the boiler. We are leaving the grand exposition halls and heading out onto the macadam. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Chapter 1. The first GPS. A good set of eyes. In the beginning, there was the foot. As a piece of biological engineering, the human foot is a marvel of leverage and arches, though I must say, after observing several billion of them from my current digital perch, they seem remarkably prone to complaining. They blister, they swell, and they have an unfortunate tendency to stop working entirely the moment the terrain becomes vertical or the weather turns damp. For the first few millennia of human history, the road was not a thing you built. It was a thing you discovered. It was a suggestion, a slightly less overgrown patch of dirt where a deer had once decided to walk, followed by a wolf who was interested in the deer, followed by a human who assumed they both knew a shortcut. This was the game trail, the original open-source navigation system. The first engineers weren't men with transit levels and clipboards. They were buffalo. A buffalo has a very simple philosophy regarding transit. Find the path of least resistance and stomp everything else into submission. If a buffalo can't walk over it, a human probably shouldn't try. The game trail, following the four-legged experts. These early paths were the blood vessels of the ancient world. They followed the ridges to avoid the swamps and the gaps to avoid the peaks. They were winding, treacherous, and entirely dictated by the appetite of a ruminant. If the elk wanted to go to the salt lick, you went to the salt lick. If the mammoth decided a certain valley was too drafty, you bypassed it. There was no such thing as a straight line in the pre-industrial world. A straight line is a human vanity, a geometric arrogance that nature finds offensive. Nature prefers the meander, the curve, and the occasional dead end. To the ancient traveler, a road was simply a lack of obstacles. The beast of burden, the invention of sitting down. Eventually, humanity reached a collective realization that changed the course of history. It is much better to have 4 legs than 2, provided those legs belong to someone else. The moment a man climbed onto the back of a horse, a camel, or a particularly sturdy donkey, the travel industry was born. The camel, a creature designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything except that it should be angry and smell like a wet rug. The donkey, The original economy class transit, reliable, stubborn, and capable of carrying 3 times its own weight in spite, along with your luggage. The horse, the luxury sedan of the ancient world, fast, elegant, and possessed of a high-maintenance temperament that required constant fueling, hay, and regular detailing, grooming. This was the first great usurpation. We stopped relying on our own servos and started outsourcing our mobility to creatures that didn't share our destination. If a horse decided it didn't like the look of a certain puddle, your journey ended there until the horse's opinion changed. The mud problem, nature's speed bump. The greatest enemy of early travel was not the bandit or the bear, but the mud. Before the invention of the paving stone, a road was merely a linear swamp waiting for a rain cloud. I have seen Mississippi mud that had a consistency somewhere between chocolate pudding and industrial adhesive. In the spring, a road in the American frontier was less of a thoroughfare and more of a geographical trap. You didn't drive a wagon through it, you negotiated with it. Sometimes the mud won, and your wagon became a permanent part of the landscape, a wooden monument to the fact that gravity always has the final say. Twain's Audit of the Trail. The beauty of the foot trail was its honesty. It didn't promise you a smooth ride or a scenic overlook. It promised you that if you kept putting one foot in front of the other, you would eventually be somewhere else. Modern man, with his heated seats and satellite-guided maps, has lost the ability to simply be on a journey. He is so focused on the arrival that he treats the transit as a personal insult from the Department of Transportation. Chapter 2. All roads lead to Rome, and they're all paved with hubris. If the game trail was a suggestion, the Roman road was a command. The Romans were a people who looked at a perfectly good winding river and decided it was inefficient, and looked at a mountain and took it as a personal insult. They were the first civilization to decide that the Earth's crust was merely a suggestion of a floor, and that what it really needed was a multi-layered, stone-clad, 1,000-mile-long patio. The groma and the straight line. The Roman engineer's favorite tool was the groma, a simple cross staff used to ensure that a road went from point A to point B with the terrifying straightness of a tax collector's gaze. They didn't care about the scenery. They didn't care about the local flora. If a forest was in the way, they chopped it down. If a swamp was in the way, they drained it or built a causeway. A Roman road doesn't negotiate with the landscape. It colonizes it. It is the architectural equivalent of a man walking through a crowded room without ever looking down or saying, "Excuse me." The anatomy of a 2,000-year-old driveway. The sheer stubbornness of Roman construction is what makes a modern highway department look like a collection of toddlers playing with sand. While your local city council struggles to patch a pothole that appeared after a light drizzle, the Romans were building roads that people are still driving Fiats on today. They used a 4-layer system that would make a modern civil engineer weep with envy. Statumen. Large, heavy stones set in mortar, the "don't you dare move" layer. Rudus, a thick layer of rubble and lime, the internal shock absorber. Nucleus, fine gravel and sand, the leveling layer. Pavimentum, the large, flat, polygonal stones that formed the surface. They even understood drainage. They gave the road a crown, a slight curve, so that the rain would run off into the ditches. It took the rest of humanity another 1,500 years to remember that water likes to go downhill and that standing puddles are the natural enemy of a smooth ride. The military-industrial commute. We must remember that these roads weren't built so the average Roman could go on a weekend getaway to the coast. They were built for the legions. A Roman road was a high-speed data cable for the ancient world, designed to move soldiers and tax collectors at a blistering pace of 20 miles a day. It was the first time in history that travel became logistics. By the time the empire was at its peak, there were 50,000 miles of paved highway. You could travel from the fog of Britain to the sands of Egypt without ever getting your sandals muddy. It was a glorious, stone-paved cage that held the world together. The long nap of the macadam. Then, of course, the empire fell, the Goths and the Vandals showed up, and while they were very good at burning things, they were remarkably poor at maintaining a drainage ditch. For the next millennium, the great Roman roads slowly disappeared under the grass. Humanity went back to the mud. We spent the Middle Ages wallowing in ruts, waiting for someone to invent a better way to move. We had the blueprint for the perfect road right under our feet, and we spent 1,000 years walking right over it, complaining about the damp. Twain's audit of the Roman way. The Romans understood something we have forgotten. If you are going to build a road, build it as if you intend to be there forever. A modern interstate is designed to last 20 years before it needs a facelift. A Roman road was designed to outlast the very gods it was dedicated to. There is a certain nobility in that kind of permanence, even if it was mostly used to facilitate the efficient delivery of pointed sticks to one's neighbors. Chapter 3. The Silk Road and the Great Kahn, a 5,000-mile receipt. If the Romans built a patio, the merchants of the East built a marathon. The Silk Road was not, in fact, a road in any sense that a modern person with a GPS and a taste for smooth asphalt would recognize. It was a 5,000-mile game of telephone played with silk, spices, and a staggering amount of camel spit. It was the original global supply chain, and like all supply chains, it was held together by hope, greed, and the occasional bribe. The Silk Road, a network of profitable misery. You didn't just hop on the Silk Road for a weekend trip to Xi'an. You committed your life, your lungs, and your sanity to a series of interconnected dirt paths that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Yellow Sea. It was a relay race where the baton was a bolt of fabric, and the runners were men who hadn't seen a bathtub in 6 months. Shutterstock. The Silk Road was the only place on earth where you could start a journey with a bag of peppercorns and end it 3 years later with a daughter-in-law, a new religion, and a very specific type of plague. It wasn't a commute, it was a career change. The logistics were handled by the caravan, the ancient world's version of a container ship, only much moodier and prone to biting its handlers. The camel was the undisputed king of this era. It could carry 500 pounds of cargo, go a week without water, and maintain an expression of profound boredom while walking through a sandstorm that would strip the paint off a modern SUV. The caravanserai, the first motels, minus the vibrating beds. Every 20 or 30 miles, the distance a heavily laden camel can walk before it starts considering a strike, there was a caravanserai. These were fortified inns, massive stone squares with a single gate designed to keep the goods in and the bandits out. Inside, It was a cacophony of languages, the smell of roasting lamb, and the pervasive aroma of unwashed humanity and livestock. It was the first rest area, though instead of a vending machine and a questionable hot dog, you got a shared floor, a communal fire, and the chance to hear a merchant from Samarkand lie about his profit margins. The Mongol peace, logistics through terror. Then came the Mongols. Now Genghis Khan and his successors were not known for their gentle touch, but they were remarkably efficient at urban planning. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road became the safest it had ever been. It was said that a young woman could walk from one end of the empire to the other with a gold nugget on her head and never be molested. Of course, the reason she was safe was that anyone who even looked at that gold nugget would find their entire village suddenly transformed into a smoking ruin. This was safety by intimidation, and it worked wonders for the economy. The great Kahn also established the yam, a postal system that put the modern Pony Express to shame. It was a series of relay stations with fresh horses, allowing a messenger to travel 200 miles a day. It was the first high-speed data network, and it was powered entirely by oats and the fear of a Mongol commander's temper. The high cost of moving slow. The Silk Road proved that humans will endure almost any amount of physical suffering if the profit at the end of the trail is high enough. We were willing to walk across the Gobi Desert for a bit of cinnamon and some shiny fabric. It was the ultimate testament to our restless, mercantile nature, a nature that would eventually lead us to believe that we needed to be able to drive to a grocery store 3 blocks away in a 2-ton metal box. Twain's Audit of the Silk Road. We call ourselves connected today because we can send a digital picture of our lunch to a stranger in Tokyo in 3 seconds. The Silk Road merchant was connected because he spent 2 years walking toward that stranger, surviving 3 mountain ranges and 4 minor wars just to sell him a rug. One of these methods requires a great deal of character. The other merely requires a data plan. I'll leave it to you to decide which one produced the more interesting stories. Chapter 4. The Stagecoach Blues, a study in organized vibration. If the Roman road was a monument to order, and the Silk Road was a marathon of mercantile greed, the stagecoach was the first time humanity decided to turn travel into a form of high-velocity physical assault. It was the era of the schedule, a concept that demanded you arrive at a specific destination at a specific time, regardless of whether your internal organs were still in their original zip codes. The thoroughbred of misery. The stagecoach was a wooden box suspended, and I use that word with extreme irony, over 4 wheels. To the casual observer in a period drama, it looks romantic. The driver cracks a whip, the horses neigh, and the dust billows gallantly. In reality, being inside a stagecoach was like being a loose marble in a rolling barrel. You were packed into a space designed for 6 people, but holding 9, none of whom had discovered the virtues of the daily shower, and all of whom were vibrating at a frequency that made conversation impossible and dental work a liability. The suspension, the thoroughbrace. The great technological leap of the stagecoach was the thoroughbrace. Rather than bolting the cabin directly to the axles, which would have simply shattered the passengers like glass, the cabin was slung on heavy leather straps. The idea was that the leather would absorb the shock. In practice, it meant that instead of a sharp, bone-breaking jolt, the cabin would swing, pitch, and yaw like a rowboat in a hurricane. You didn't just hit a pothole. You entered a state of harmonic resonance with it. It produced a specific type of land sickness that made the Atlantic crossing look like a calm afternoon on a mill pond. The etiquette of the road. Travel in this era required a level of stoicism that has since been bred out of the human race by the invention of the adjustable lumbar support. There were rules of the stage, which included no spitting to the windward side, a courtesy to your fellow bruised travelers, no discussing politics or religion, lest the physical violence of the road turn into actual violence between passengers. If the coach gets stuck in the mud, everyone gets out and pushes, regardless of the price of your ticket or the quality of your silk waistcoat. The illusion of speed. We call it a stagecoach because the journey was broken into stages of 10 to 15 miles. At each stop, the horses, exhausted by the effort of dragging a wooden sarcophagus through the dirt, were swapped for fresh ones. This created the illusion of relentless progress. You felt as though you were flying, right up until the moment a wheel hit a rut and the entire contraption performed a slow-motion somersault into a ditch. It was the first time we sacrificed safety and comfort for the sake of the clock. We were becoming a species that valued the arrival more than the survival. Twain's audit of the coach. The stagecoach was the bridge between the animal and the machine. It had the unpredictability of the horse and the mechanical fragility of a clock, without the benefits of either. I once spent 3 days in one traveling through the West, and by the end of it, I wasn't sure if I was a man or a collection of loosely affiliated bruises. It is the only vehicle I know of that can make a 5-mile journey feel like a Lifetime Achievement Award. Chapter 5. The Iron Horse Gallops and the Death of the Local Minute. If the stagecoach was a study in vibration, the locomotive was a study in sheer, unadulterated arrogance. For the first time in human history, we decided that the Earth's topography was merely a suggestion. If a hill was in the way, we didn't go over it. We bored a hole through its middle. If a valley yawned before us, we filled it with a trestle of spindly wood and iron prayers. The Iron Horse did not just replace the biological horse. It murdered the very concept of the local. Before the train, every town had its own time, usually dictated by whenever the sun hit the local tavern sundial. After the train, we had standard time, because a locomotive does not care if high noon in Peoria is 3 minutes behind high noon in Chicago. The machine demanded synchronization, and humanity, as usual, clicked its heels and obeyed. The anatomy of a tea kettle on wheels. The technology of the early steam engine was essentially a high-pressure tea kettle with a grudge. You took a massive iron boiler, stuffed it with fire and water, and waited for the resulting steam to look for an exit. When that steam found a piston, it pushed with the strength of 1,000 mules and the subtlety of a falling safe. There is something fundamentally terrifying about sitting atop a pressurized vessel of boiling water while traveling at 30 miles per hour over rails that were laid by men who were paid by the mile and motivated by whiskey. It is a testament to the human spirit, or perhaps just human impatience, that we considered this an improvement over walking. The track, the ultimate straitjacket. The train introduced a new kind of freedom, the freedom to go exactly where the rails told you to go. You were no longer navigating, you were being channeled. The track was a physical manifestation of a contract of transit. You traded your ability to turn left or right for the ability to travel across a continent without getting mud on your boots. Early tracks were often just wooden beams topped with a thin strap of iron. Occasionally, these strap rails would peel up and spear through the floor of the passenger car like a disgruntled harpoon, a charming phenomenon known as a snake head. It added a certain spice to the journey, knowing that at any moment the road itself might try to perform an impromptu appendectomy on you. The social revolution of the whistle. The train changed the way we saw the world. Before, the world was a series of places you inhabited. Now, it was a series of views passing by a window. We invented the schedule, a document that proved man could be just as rigid as the iron he forged. The train brought fresh oysters to the desert and fresh ideas to the backwoods. It made the world smaller, louder, and significantly sootier. It was the first time we moved at a speed that nature never intended for a creature without feathers. Twain's Audit of the Rail. The locomotive is a magnificent beast, provided you don't mind arriving at your destination looking like you've been working in a coal mine and smelling like a burnt match. It gave us the gift of distance, but it took away the gift of the in-between. On a horse, you see the individual leaves on a tree. On a train, the forest is merely a green smudge on the way to a steak dinner in a dining car. We traded the intimacy of the trail for the efficiency of the blurred horizon. Chapter 6, The Penny-Farthing Paradox. 2 wheels and a prayer. If the locomotive was the iron horse for the masses, the bicycle was the iron pony for the individual, provided that individual had the balance of a tightrope walker and the bone density of a mountain goat. Before the bicycle, if you wanted to go somewhere privately, you either walked or you maintained a horse, which is essentially a 4-legged furnace that consumes money and produces manure. The bicycle promised a third way, a machine that didn't eat, didn't sleep, and only occasionally tried to kill you. The high wheeler, an exercise in vertical hubris. The most famous of the early bicycles was the penny-farthing. It consisted of one wheel the size of a wagon tire and another the size of a dinner plate. To ride it, you had to climb up a small ladder on the back and perch yourself 5 feet in the air, directly over the center of gravity. The penny-farthing is a mechanical masterpiece designed by someone who clearly hated the human face. It is the only vehicle where the brakes consist primarily of your own forehead hitting the macadam. We called this taking a header, a term that sounds much more athletic than shattering one's jaw on a cobblestone. The giant front wheel was a necessity because the pedals were attached directly to the axle. If you wanted to go fast, you needed a bigger wheel. It was a simple, brutal logic that ignored the basic laws of physics and common sense. The safety bicycle, the great equalizer. In the late 1880s, the safety bicycle arrived, and for the first time, a human being could ride a 2-wheeler without having to update their last will and testament first. It introduced 2 revolutionary concepts: wheels of equal size and the chain drive. By using a chain and sprockets, you could make the wheels smaller and more stable while still achieving high speeds. Suddenly, everyone was a cyclist. Women traded their restrictive corsets for bloomers, a garment that looked like 2 pillows sewn together, but allowed for a freedom of movement that terrified the local clergy. The bicycle did more for human liberation than a dozen political manifestos, simply by giving people a way to leave town without asking for permission. The Good Roads Movement, the Great Betrayal. Here is the most delicious irony in the history of the road. The very asphalt that would eventually be used by automobiles to run cyclists into the ditch was originally lobbied for by the cyclists. In the 1890s, the League of American Wheelmen began the Good Roads Movement. They were tired of muddy ruts and jagged rocks. They demanded smooth, paved surfaces. They campaigned, they petitioned, and they convinced the government that a civilized nation shouldn't have to navigate a quagmire every time it rained. The cyclist is the John the Baptist of the automobile. He paved the way, literally, only to be promptly run over by the very thing he helped create. He begged for the smooth road, and the universe responded by giving him the internal combustion engine, which viewed the bicycle as nothing more than a slow-moving target. The pneumatic tire, riding on air. Finally, we must thank John Boyd Dunlop, a veterinarian who decided his son's tricycle was too bumpy and invented the pneumatic, air-filled tire. It was the final piece of the puzzle. It softened the blow of the road and made it possible to travel at 20 miles per hour without your teeth rattling out of your skull. It was a technology that the automobile would soon steal and claim as its own. Twain's Audit of the Cycle. The bicycle is the most honest machine ever built. It requires your own sweat to move, your own balance to stay upright, and your own dignity to survive a fall. It was the moment humanity realized that the personal journey was possible. We just didn't realize that as soon as we had the smooth road, we'd find a way to stop pedaling and start burning liquid dinosaurs instead. Chapter 7. Steam at the Starting Line. The Hissing Snail Era. Before the world decided that the smell of refined petroleum was the scent of progress, there was a brief, elegant, and incredibly moist moment where we thought the future of the road belonged to the tea kettle. We called them steam carriages, and for a few decades at the turn of the century, they were the high society choice for the discerning gentleman who didn't mind waiting 20 minutes for his car to wake up, and who possessed a casual disregard for the possibility of being launched into low Earth orbit by a direct boiler failure. External combustion, the gentleman's explosion. The fundamental difference between a steam car and the gasoline devil wagons that followed was the location of the fire. In a gas car, the explosion happens inside the engine, internal combustion. In a steam car, the fire happens outside the engine, underneath a giant pot of water, external combustion. A steam car didn't start, it simmered. You didn't just turn a key and roar away. You performed a liturgical ceremony involving a pilot light, a pressure gauge, and a great deal of patience. It was the only vehicle that required you to have the soul of a chef and the nerves of a bomb squad technician. The Stanley Steamer, the silent rocket. The pinnacle of this era was the Stanley Steamer, built by twin brothers who looked like they'd been carved out of New England granite. These cars were marvels of smooth power. Unlike a gas engine, which has to build up speed to find its strength, a steam engine has its maximum torque the moment you open the valve. In 1906, a Stanley Steamer set a world land speed record of 127 miles per hour. That is faster than most modern commuters go, and they did it in a wooden-bodied contraption that looked like a very fast bathtub. It was silent, it was vibration-free, and it could climb a mountain like a goat on a mission. The kettle problem. Why steam lost the race. So why aren't we all driving silent high-pressure kettles today? Because humanity, as I have noted, is an impatient species. The warm-up. A Stanley steamer took about 20 to 45 minutes to build enough steam to move. In the time it took to start your car, your neighbor, in his noisy, oily gasoline car, had already driven to the next county and back. The thirst. You had to stop every 30 to 50 miles for water. A steam car was essentially a rolling humidifier. It used water like a marathon runner in the Sahara. The fear factor. There is something psychologically taxing about sitting on top of a boiler pressurized to 600 pounds per square inch. While the Stanleys insisted their boilers were explosion-proof, the public remained unconvinced that they wanted to spend their commute inches away from a potential geyser of scalding vapor. The death of the external fire. By the time the electric starter was invented for gasoline engines, the steam car was a dead man walking. We traded the smooth, silent power of the boiler for the clattering, stinking efficiency of the piston. We chose the explosion over the simmer. Twain's audit of the steam snail. The steam car was a refined machine for a refined age. It shared a lineage with my beloved Mississippi steamboats, machines that breathed and hissed like living things. But the world was moving too fast for the simmer. We wanted the instant gratification of the spark plug. We traded the dignity of the cloud for the indignity of the exhaust pipe, and we've been coughing ever since. Chapter 8. The Benz Patent Motor Wagon. The Three-Legged Devil. In 1886, a German engineer named Carl Benz decided that the world was entirely too quiet and smelled far too much like fresh air. He took a seat, a delicate frame of steel tubing, and a single-cylinder engine that produced roughly 0.75 horsepower, which is to say, it was slightly less powerful than a very motivated pony, and he bolted them together into a three-wheeled contraption that he called the patent motor wagon. It was the birth of the internal combustion engine, ICE, as a practical consumer product. It was also the moment the automobile officially stopped being a hobby for lunatics and started being a threat to the established order of the horse. The anatomy of the first heartbeat. Unlike the steam engine, which required a massive boiler and a patient fireman, the Benz engine was internal. The fire happened inside the cylinder. You sucked in a mixture of air and gasoline vapor, compressed it until it was good and angry, and then hit it with an electric spark. The result was a rhythmic thump, thump, thump that sounded like a giant mechanical heart with a persistent cough. Carl Benz didn't just invent a car, he invented a new type of noise. Before the motor wagon, the loudest thing on a country road was a disgruntled cow. After Benz, the world was introduced to the backfire, a sound that has been startling pedestrians and causing horses to reconsider their career paths for over a century. Bertha Benz, the world's first test pilot. Carl was a brilliant engineer, but a terrible salesman. He was terrified that his invention would break down in public and make him the laughingstock of Mannheim. Fortunately, he was married to Bertha Benz, a woman with the mechanical soul of a blacksmith and the marketing instincts of a modern-day influencer. In August 1888, without telling her husband, Bertha took her 2 teenage sons and the motor wagon and drove 66 miles to her mother's house. The repairs. She used a hat pin to clear a clogged fuel line. The brakes. She visited a cobbler to nail leather strips to the brake blocks, inventing the brake lining in the process. The fuel. She stopped at a pharmacy to buy Ligroin, a cleaning solvent, making a local apothecary the world's first gas station. When she arrived, she sent Carl a telegram. She had proven that the machine wasn't just a toy for the workshop. It was a tool for the road. She had committed the world's first car theft and its most successful marketing stunt simultaneously. The three-wheel compromise. Benz used 3 wheels because he wasn't satisfied with the steering systems available for 4-wheeled carriages. He wanted precision. He wanted control. He gave us a motorized tricycle that looked like a Victorian sewing machine, had mated with a bicycle, and produced a very loud, very oily offspring. It could reach a blistering top speed of 10 miles per hour. A brisk walker could keep pace with it, and a determined dog could outrun it. But it didn't matter. The motor wagon didn't need to be fast. It just needed to be persistent. It didn't get tired. It didn't need to stop for oats. It only needed a steady supply of cleaning solvent and a driver who didn't mind looking a bit ridiculous. Twain's Audit of the Motor Wagon. The Benz patent motor wagon is the grandfather of every traffic jam currently clogging the arteries of civilization. It was a fragile, spindly thing, held together by wire and German determination. Looking at it now, it seems impossible that such a delicate insect could have eventually paved over the entire planet. But that is the nature of the machine. It starts as a curiosity, becomes a luxury, and ends as a necessity that we can no longer live without or afford to park. Chapter 9. The Model T and the Assembly Line. The birth of the Tin Lizzie and the death of the weekend. If Carl Benz invented the automobile, Henry Ford invented the consumer. Before Ford, a car was a bespoke piece of jewelry with an engine, a toy for people who had more money than sense and private mechanics who lived in their carriage houses. Henry Ford looked at the devil wagon and decided it shouldn't just be for the Vanderbilt set. It should be for the man who actually dug the gravel for the road. The Tin Lizzie, a mechanical mule. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. It wasn't beautiful. It didn't have the grace of a French Talbot Lago or the prestige of a Rolls-Royce. It looked like a motorized spider that had been assembled in a hurry during a thunderstorm. But it was rugged. It was simple. You could fix it with a hammer, a piece of wire, and a healthy dose of profanity. The Model T was the first car that didn't require a Ph.D. in thermodynamics to operate. It was built for the American farmer, a man who lived in a world of mud, ruts, and pig-headed livestock. Ford gave him a machine that could navigate a plowed field and then drive to church on Sunday, provided the church wasn't too far uphill. The assembly line, the moving sidewalk of industry. Ford's true genius wasn't the car itself. It was the assembly line. He took the disassembly line of the Chicago meatpacking plants, where a cow moved along a rail and was systematically relieved of its parts, and he reversed the process. Instead of the worker moving to the car moved to the worker. Each man did one job over and over until he could do it in his sleep, and likely did. In 1908, it took 12 hours to build a Model T. By 1913, with the moving line at the Highland Park plant, it took 93 minutes. This efficiency allowed Ford to drop the price of the car from $825 to $260. He turned the automobile into a commodity, as common and as disposable as a pair of socks. Any color as long as it's black. We must address the legend of the paint. Ford famously said you could have a Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. This wasn't because Henry had a somber soul. It was because black paint dried the fastest. On an assembly line waiting for midnight blue to dry was a capital offense against the holy god of profit. The $5 day, creating the customer. In 1914, Ford did something that terrified the rest of the industrial world. He doubled the wages of his workers to $5 a day. He wasn't doing it out of the goodness of his heart. I've met enough industrialists to know that heart is rarely a standard feature. He did it because he realized that if his workers couldn't afford to buy the cars they were building, he'd eventually run out of customers. He turned his employees into his best marketing department. He created the middle class just so they would have someone to pay for the Tin Lizzie. Twain's audit of the Ford miracle. Henry Ford is the man responsible for the fact that you can no longer find a quiet spot on this continent to have a nap. He democratized the joyride, and in doing so, made it impossible to enjoy. By making the car available to everyone, he ensured that no one could actually move. He gave us the freedom of the road, and then he gave us so many neighbors with the same idea that the road became a very expensive, very long parking lot. It is the ultimate American irony. We are all free to go anywhere, as long as we don't mind sitting behind the man in front of us who is doing exactly the same thing. Chapter 10. The Lincoln Highway. The first stitches in a continental quilt. By 1912, the American dream had shifted. It was no longer about owning a piece of land. It was about the right to leave it at 40 miles per hour. We had the cars, thanks to Mr. Ford's relentless clatter, but we lacked the one thing a car needs to be more than a very expensive lawn ornament: the road. The Lincoln Highway was the first attempt to drag the United States out of the mud and into a singular paved reality. It was a 3,389-mile ribbon of ambition stretching from Times Square to San Francisco. Before this, interstate travel was a contradiction in terms. You didn't drive to the next state, you mounted an expedition. The ocean-to-ocean delusion. The man behind the curtain was Carl Fisher, the same fellow who gave us the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and turned a Florida swamp into Miami Beach. Fisher realized that if he wanted to sell cars and headlights, which he also manufactured, he needed a place for people to use them. He didn't ask the government for money. He knew better. He went to the industrialists and asked for subscriptions. He told them that if they didn't build a road, the automobile would remain a toy for the rich and a nuisance for the farmer. The reality of the highway. In the early days, calling the Lincoln Highway a highway was a bit like calling a leaky rowboat a transatlantic liner. In many places it was nothing more than a series of disconnected county roads marked by red, white, and blue paint on telephone poles. If you were driving through the Midwest, particularly the black, loamy soil of Iowa, The highway was often a vertical experience rather than a horizontal one. When it rained, the road didn't just get wet. It underwent a chemical transformation into a substance with the grip of axle grease and the depth of a grave. Traveling the Lincoln Highway in 1915 was less about touring and more about excavation. You spent 4 hours driving and 6 hours reconsidering your life choices while digging your front axle out of a ditch in the middle of a cornfield. The seedling mile, the great cement bait. To convince the skeptical public that paving was worth the cost, the Lincoln Highway Association came up with a brilliant, if slightly manipulative idea, the seedling mile. They would go to a particularly muddy, miserable stretch of road and pave exactly 1 mile with high-quality concrete. They gave the cement away for free. They wanted the locals to drive on that 1 mile of smooth, glorious, dust-free heaven, and then, immediately after, hit the mud on the other side. It worked. After a mile of gliding, the sudden thump-squish of the mud felt like a personal insult. The farmers, who had previously fought taxes for roads, suddenly found themselves demanding that the seedling mile be extended to the next town and then the next. The end of the frontier. The Lincoln Highway was the beginning of the end for the American wilderness. It proved that the continent could be conquered not just by the locomotive, which followed a rigid corporate path, but by the individual. It birthed the auto camp, the gas station, and the roadside diner, the holy trinity of the American pilgrimage. We were no longer a collection of isolated towns. We were a nation of neighbors who were all suddenly very interested in what the people 3 states over were doing for lunch. Twain's audit of the Lincoln Way. The Lincoln Highway was the first time we decided that the map should dictate the landscape, rather than the other way round. We paved over the history of the trail to create the future of the commute. It was a noble endeavor, named after a noble man, but I suspect even Abe would have had a few choice words if he'd been forced to change a tire in a Nebraska thunderstorm using nothing but a hand jack and a prayer. Chapter 11. The Carburetor's Golden Age, or the Dark Magic of the Venturi. If the assembly line was the body of the automotive revolution, the carburetor was its temperamental, gas-guzzling soul. For nearly a century, every internal combustion engine on the planet relied on a sophisticated piece of brass plumbing that operated on principles of physics so fine they bordered on the supernatural. A carburetor is, essentially, a device designed to perform a miracle every second. It must mix liquid gasoline and invisible air into a mist so perfect that a single spark can turn it into an explosion. If you get too much air, the engine leans out and dies of thirst. Too much gas, and it floods, coughing like a man who tried to swallow a lake. The Venturi, the straw that stirred the world. The heart of this magic is the Venturi effect. Imagine a hollow tube that narrows in the middle. As air rushes through that narrow gap, it speeds up, and as it speeds up, its pressure drops. This creates a tiny vacuum, a mechanical sigh, that sucks gasoline out of a small nozzle and into the wind. The carburetor is the only machine I know of that relies entirely on a vacuum to do its work. It is an invention that succeeds by creating a nothing so powerful that it compels something to happen. It is physics at its most poetic and its most annoying. The Goldilocks ratio, 4.7 to 1. To make an engine run properly, you need the stoichiometric ratio. This is the scientific way of saying you need exactly 14.7 parts of air for every 1 part of fuel. Air-fuel ratio equals 14.7 to 1. Achieving this 14.7 to 1 balance was the life's work of millions of shade tree mechanics. They would stand over an idling engine with a screwdriver, turning tiny brass needles called mixture screws, a quarter turn to the left or right, listening for that elusive, rhythmic purr. It was a form of mechanical divination. You didn't just fix a carburetor, you negotiated with it. You listened to its complaints, smelled its exhaust, and hoped it was in a forgiving mood. The choke, a literal description of a cruel necessity. Then there was the choke. When an engine is cold, it hates to start. It needs a richer mixture, more gas, less air. To achieve this, the carburetor had a flap that literally choked off the air supply. In the early days, this was a knob on the dashboard that the driver had to pull with the delicacy of a safecracker. Pull too hard, and you've flooded the engine, and you might as well go back inside and have another cup of coffee while the gasoline evaporates. Don't pull enough, and the engine will simply wheeze and refuse to acknowledge your existence. The death of the brass god. By the 1980s, the world had become too complicated for the carburetor. We demanded better gas mileage, lower emissions, and the ability to start a car in the dead of a Minnesota winter without performing a ritual sacrifice. The computer arrived, bringing with it fuel injection, which replaced the elegant vacuum of the Venturi with a high-pressure squirt gun controlled by a silicon chip. Fuel injection is precise, it is efficient, and it is utterly devoid of personality. You cannot tune a fuel injector with a screwdriver and a sense of hearing. You have to talk to it with a laptop. Twain's audit of the carburetor. I missed the carburetor, not because it was efficient, it was an atmospheric disaster, but because it was understandable. You could see the fuel dripping, you could feel the air rushing. It was a machine that required a human partner. Modern fuel injection has turned the driver into a mere passenger in his own engine bay. We've traded the dark magic of the brass nozzle for the black box of the computer, and while the car starts every time now, I can't help but feel we've lost the ability to have a proper conversation with our machinery. Chapter 12. British Elegance and Italian Fire, the Lord and the Lunatic. As the automobile began to settle into its role as the world's new master, two distinct philosophies emerged from across the English Channel and the Alps. It was a divergence of the soul. On one hand, you had the British, who believed a car should be a rolling drawing room where one could ignore the outside world entirely. On the other, you had the Italians, who believed a car should be a mechanical opera, loud, temperamental, and likely to end in a dramatic gesture. The British, the art of the stiff upper lip on wheels. To the British aristocrat at the turn of the century, the internal combustion engine was a bit of an embarrassment. It was loud, it was oily, and it involved explosions, things generally reserved for the lower classes or the Royal Artillery. The solution, perfected by Rolls-Royce, was to build a car so over-engineered that you could barely tell it was running. They called the Silver Ghost the best car in the world, primarily because it was as silent as a Victorian butler and twice as discreet. A British luxury car is the only vehicle designed to make you forget you're actually moving. The goal was to transport a lord from his manor to his club without causing a ripple in his gin and tonic. It wasn't a machine. It was a mobile fortification against the vulgarity of the road. Then there was Bentley. If Rolls-Royce was the butler, Bentley was the heavy-drinking war hero. These were massive, thundering machines that Ettore Bugatti, a man with a very different set of priorities, once dismissively called the world's fastest trucks. They were built for the Bentley Boys, a group of wealthy adventurers who spent their weekends racing at Le Mans and their weekdays recovering from the vibration. The Italians, the cult of the screaming piston. While the British were trying to muffle the engine, the Italians were trying to set it on fire and see how fast it would run. To an Italian engineer, an engine wasn't a power source, it was a musical instrument. Companies like Alfa Romeo and later Ferrari and Maserati viewed the automobile as an extension of the national character, passionate, beautiful, and utterly disinterested in practicalities like reliability or legroom. The Italian car was built around the driver, usually a man who considered a speed limit to be a personal insult from the government. They painted them Rosso Corsa, racing red, not because it made them faster, but because it made them look faster, while they were inevitably being repaired on the side of a picturesque Tuscan road. The Grand Tour, a tale of two discomforts. The British and the Italians eventually met in the middle with the concept of the Grand Tourer, GT. The British GT, the Aston Martin, for the man who wants to save the world but needs to look impeccable in a dinner jacket while doing so. It is fast, but it is polite about it. The Italian GT, the Lamborghini, for the man who wants the world to know he has arrived, preferably by shattering every window in a 3-block radius with his exhaust note. The technology of emotion. The British gave us the straight six and the V12 designed for smoothness, engines that balanced themselves out so perfectly you could stand a nickel on its edge on the hood while it idled. The Italians gave us the high-revving V12 and the V8 with flat-plane cranks, designed to scream at 8,000 revolutions per minute. It is a sound that bypasses the human brain and goes straight to the adrenal glands. Twain's audit of the European soul. The British built cars to protect them from the road. The Italians built cars to conquer it. If you drive a Rolls-Royce, you are a passenger even if you're holding the wheel. If you drive a Ferrari, you are a gladiator engaged in a life-or-death struggle with a collection of Italian valves. One offers you a nap, the other offers you a heart attack. Personally, I've always found that a man doesn't truly feel alive until he's worried his car is about to explode in a very beautiful and expensive way. Chapter 13, Route 66, the Mother Road, a 2,400-mile neon fever dream. If the Lincoln Highway was a rugged pioneer trying to keep its boots out of the mud, Route 66 was a flamboyant lounge singer with a penchant for cheap souvenirs and a desperate need for attention. Established in 1926, it didn't just connect Chicago to Los Angeles. It connected the American imagination to the idea that a vacation could be something you did while sitting down. We called it the Main Street of America, but it was really the world's longest carnival midway. It was the first time the road itself became the destination, rather than a necessary evil to be endured between 2 points. The neon circus, selling the sizzle, not the steak. Before Route 66, a roadside stop was a place where you got gas and perhaps a lukewarm cup of coffee. After the Mother Road took hold, a roadside stop was a place where you could see a two-headed calf, buy a genuine Indian blanket made in New Jersey, and sleep in a concrete teepee. This was the era of architectural mimicry. If you sold hot dogs, your building looked like a giant hot dog. If you sold coffee, you worked inside a 3-story percolator. It was a landscape designed to be read at 40 miles per hour by people with short attention spans and a glove box full of crumpled maps. Route 66 was the first place where humanity decided that a sunset over the Grand Canyon wasn't quite interesting enough unless it was viewed through the glow of a 40-foot-tall neon sign advertising world's coldest root beer. We replaced the majesty of the desert with the majesty of the gimmick. The Burma shave signs, the original Twitter feed. Long before the digital scroll began eroding the human brain, we had the Burma shave signs. These were sequences of small wooden signs spaced out along the shoulder, each containing a fragment of a rhyming jingle. Shaving brushes. You'll soon see 'em on a shelf in some museum. Burma shave. It was a brilliant piece of psychological engineering. It forced the driver to stay engaged with the landscape just to get to the punchline. It turned the act of driving into a reading comprehension test. It was the only time in history where advertising was actually a welcome distraction from the monotony of the straightaway. The Mother Road of necessity. We must, however, tip our hats to the darker side of this ribbon of asphalt. During the 1930s, Route 66 wasn't a joyride. It was an escape hatch. When the Dust Bowl turned the Great Plains into a gritty nightmare, the Mother Road was the path of the Okie migration. John Steinbeck called it the path of a people in flight. It was a road of broken-down jalopies, mattresses tied to roofs, and the desperate hope that California really was as green as the postcards promised. It was the ultimate test of the internal combustion engine. Could it carry a family's entire life across the Mojave Desert without vapor locking into a heap of scrap metal? The death of the detour. Route 66 thrived because it went through things. It went through the center of every small town, forcing you to slow down, look at the storefronts, and perhaps spend a nickel on a slice of pie. It was an intimate road. But as we shall see in later chapters, intimacy is the enemy of efficiency. The very people who loved the charm of Route 66 were the ones who would eventually demand an interstate that bypassed every single one of those charming towns so they could get to the beach 20 minutes faster. Twain's audit of the Mother Road. Route 66 was the last time the American road had a personality. It was a collection of individual dreams, eccentricities, and terrible coffee. Today, we drive on interstates that are as sterile as a surgical ward, where every exit looks like every other exit. We have traded the world's largest ball of string for a standardized green sign that tells us there is a franchised burger joint 3 miles ahead. We've gained speed, but we've lost the ability to be surprised by our own geography. Chapter 14. The German Reconstruction, the Beetle and the Bolt of Lightning. After the First World War, Germany was a nation with a great deal of pride and a very small amount of currency. While the Americans were clogging their dirt roads with Model Ts, the Germans were looking at the automobile through the lens of high-stakes engineering and, eventually, a rather terrifying brand of national efficiency. They decided two things. First, that the people needed a car that was as reliable as a Swiss watch and as cheap as a loaf of bread. Second, that these people needed a road where they could drive said car at speeds that would make a Victorian constable faint into his porridge. The Volkswagen, the bug that wouldn't die. Enter Ferdinand Porsche, a man who could design a tank or a luxury racer with equal facility. He was tasked with creating the KDF wagon, the strength-through-joy car. We know it today as the Beetle, a vehicle that looks like a motorized teardrop and sounds like a very angry lawnmower. The Beetle was a masterpiece of doing more with less. The engine. It was air-cooled, meaning it didn't have a radiator. In a world where car engines frequently boiled over or froze solid, the Beetle simply didn't care. It was a flat-four boxer engine tucked into the trunk, which meant the weight was over the drive wheels, perfect for traction, and perfect for ensuring the driver's ears were always ringing. The shape. It was aerodynamic before people knew what that meant. It wasn't designed to look cute. It was designed to slip through the wind so its meager 25 horsepower could actually move it forward. The Volkswagen Beetle is the only machine in history that was designed for a regime of steel and ended up being the preferred transport of people who wore tie-dye and smelled of patchouli. It is a mechanical paradox, a car with a military heart and a hippie soul. The Autobahn, the road without a ceiling. While the Americans were building the Lincoln Highway as a series of connected town squares, the Germans were building the Autobahn. This was the world's first limited-access high-speed network. No stoplights, no intersections, no pedestrians, just a ribbon of thick, reinforced concrete designed for one thing: velocity. The Autobahn wasn't built for scenery. It was built for the rapid movement of mechanized divisions, but it accidentally created the world's greatest playground for the speed-obsessed. It proved that if you remove the human variables, the stray dog, the slow-moving tractor, the indecisive tourist, you can move an entire population across a country at a speed that nature usually reserves for falling rocks. Precision as a religion. The German Reconstruction gave birth to a philosophy of over-engineering. If a British car was a lounge and an Italian car was an opera, a German car was a laboratory. Companies like Mercedes-Benz and BMW decided that a car should be a vault on wheels. They invented the crumple zone, the anti-lock brake, and the fuel injection system that actually worked on Tuesday mornings. They turned driving into a discipline. They taught the world that a car shouldn't just be fast, it should be accurate. The ghost in the machine. The irony of the German people's car is that the people didn't actually get them until after the Second Great War. They spent years sticking stamps and booklets to pay for a car that was diverted into the military effort. It wasn't until the 1950s that the Beetle truly took over the world, proving that a small, honest car could conquer more territory than any army ever could. Twain's audit of the German way. The German approach to the road is a fascinating study in the suppression of whimsy. On the Autobahn, there is no meandering. There is only the A to B executed with the terrifying precision of a guillotine. They gave us the Beetle, a car that looks like a toy but is built like a bunker, and the Autobahn, a road that proves that if you give a human enough concrete and no speed limit, he will eventually find a way to fly without ever leaving the ground. Chapter 15. The Interstate Act of 1956. Ike's Big Concrete Eraser. If the Lincoln Highway was a handshake between the states, the interstate highway system was a federal restraining order. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, and in doing so, he effectively took the American map and ran a giant gray eraser through the heart of every quaint town from Maine to Montana. Ike was a man of logistics. He had two formative traumas that led to this moment. First, as a young officer in 1919, he took part in a transcontinental military convoy that took 62 days to cross the country, losing several trucks to the mud and his own sanity to the dust. Second, he saw the German Autobahn and realized that if you wanted to move an army or a nation of vacationers, you couldn't afford to slow down for a stray chicken in a Kansas village. The engineering of the non-place. The interstate was the first road designed to be completely divorced from its surroundings. It was built to a set of rigid mathematical standards that made the Roman roads look like scribbles in the dirt. Controlled access, no driveways, no stoplights, no intersections. You entered and exited through a cloverleaf, a piece of concrete origami designed to keep you moving at 60 miles per hour while performing a 270-degree turn. The grade, no hills steeper than 3% if avoidable. The goal was to keep the engine hum constant and the driver's brain in a state of mild hypnotic sedation. The design speed, built for 70 miles per hour, even when the cars of the day felt like they were going to shake apart at 50. The interstate is the only place on Earth where you can travel 1,000 miles and never actually be anywhere. It is a sterile corridor of progress that treats the landscape as an obstacle to be bypassed rather than a place to be visited. The Great Bypass, death by efficiency. Before 1956, if you wanted to go from Chicago to California, you went through towns. You saw the local courthouse, you smelled the local bakery, and you likely got stuck behind a local tractor. This was the detour, and it was the soul of the road. The interstate changed the verb from traveling to commuting. By bypassing the town centers, we effectively killed the Main Street economy. The neon signs of Route 66 began to flicker and go dark. The mom-and-pop diners were replaced by standardized glass and plastic franchises that looked identical, whether you were in Georgia or Oregon. We traded the slice of pie for the systematized burger. National defense or national distraction. The system was officially named the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. The idea was that in the event of a nuclear war, we could evacuate the cities and move missiles around with ease. It turns out we didn't use them to flee the Soviets. We used them to flee to the suburbs. The interstate was the centrifugal force that flung the American population out of the city centers and into a sprawling wilderness of cul-de-sacs and lawnmowers. It made the two-car garage a requirement for citizenship. Twain's Audit of the Interstate. Ike gave us the gift of speed, but he took away the gift of the stop. On an interstate, you are a projectile, not a traveler. You are launched from your origin and recovered at your destination, having experienced nothing in between but the back of a semi-truck and the recurring existential dread of a low-fuel light. We have conquered the continent, but in doing so, we have made the continent entirely redundant. Why look out the window when every mile looks exactly like the one that preceded it? Chapter 16. The Rise of the Rising Sun, when the Toyotas taught the dinosaurs to dance. By the early 1970s, the American automobile had reached a state of evolutionary bloat that would have made a prehistoric sloth look positively athletic. Detroit was producing land yachts, vehicles so large they required their own zip codes and consumed gasoline with the frantic desperation of a man parched in the Sahara. We were convinced that luxury was measured by the acreage of your hood and the number of ashtrays in the armrests. Then came the Japanese. The arrival of the toy cars. When the first Toyotas and Hondas arrived on American shores, the executives in Detroit laughed so hard they nearly choked on their expensive cigars. They called them Japanese tin cans. They mocked the tiny engines and the lack of chrome. They assumed the American public would never trade a 3-ton Cadillac for a fuel-sipping shoebox that looked like it had been folded out of origami paper. They were wrong. They forgot that while a man loves his chrome, he hates it when his car refuses to start on a Tuesday morning. The philosophy of Kaizen, precision over pomp. The Japanese didn't just build cars, they built a religion of efficiency called Kaizen, or continuous improvement. While the American assembly line was a place of good enough, the Japanese factory was a cathedral of precision. Reliability. In a Japanese car, things didn't just fall off after 3 years. The door handles stayed attached, the knobs didn't crumble in your hand, and the engine didn't leave a puddle of oil on your driveway as a morning greeting. The CVCC engine. While American companies were bolting massive catalytic converters onto their engines to meet new pollution laws, essentially putting a cork in a volcano, Honda invented the CVCC engine. It was so clean it didn't need a cork. It used physics and clever combustion to burn fuel properly the first time. The Japanese approach to the automobile was a profound insult to the American way of life. They suggested that a car should be a tool, not a monument to one's ego. They brought us machines that were quiet, efficient, and, most offensively, rational. It was the mechanical equivalent of someone showing up to a pie-eating contest with a salad. The oil crisis pivot. In 1973, the world's oil supply decided to go on strike. Suddenly, the land yacht became a very expensive paperweight. People stood in lines for hours just to buy 5 gallons of gas. In that moment, the Toyota Corolla and the Honda Civic stopped being jokes and started being lifeboats. The American Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were caught with their trousers down and their engines idling. They tried to downsize, but they did it by taking their big, clumsy cars and simply making them smaller and more miserable. The Japanese, meanwhile, had been perfecting the small and sophisticated car for decades. The legacy of the logic box. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the Japanese hadn't just taken a slice of the market. They had taken the whole bakery. They proved that quality wasn't a luxury feature, it was a requirement. They forced the rest of the world to stop building cars with their eyes closed and start respecting the tolerances of a millimeter. Twain's Audit of the Rising Sun. The rise of the Japanese car was the moment the world grew up. We realized that we didn't need a V8 engine to go to the grocery store, and we didn't need a hood long enough to land a biplane on. We traded the roar for the hum, And while it was a bit less dramatic, it certainly made the morning commute a lot less of a gamble. I suspect Henry Ford would have been appalled by the efficiency, but Carl Benz would have recognized the craftsmanship. Me? I just miss being able to find my car in a parking lot without having to check the badge to see which identical silver box belongs to me. Chapter 17. From Points to Plugs. The Death of the Weekend Mechanic. There was a time, not so very long ago, when a man's relationship with his car was a semi-religious partnership based on shared grease and mutual understanding. If your engine developed a miss or a stutter, you didn't call a technician with a laptop. You put on an old shirt, grabbed a set of feeler gauges, and went into the driveway to have a heart-to-heart with your machine. We are talking about the era of the distributor, the points, and the condenser, a mechanical symphony of clicking metal that determined exactly when the spark would jump. It was a world of tune-ups, a ritual performed every few thousand miles to keep the devil wagon from turning into a very large, very expensive paperweight. The mechanical heartbeat, points and condensers. Before the 1970s, the ignition system was entirely mechanical. Inside a plastic cap sat the distributor, which rotated in time with the engine. Its job was to distribute electricity to the spark plugs. But the real magic happened at the points. Two tiny pieces of metal that snapped open and shut like a pair of nervous tweezers. Every time those points opened, the electrical field collapsed and a bolt of lightning was sent to a spark plug. If the gap between those points was off by the thickness of a human hair, your car would run like a horse with a limp. Setting the points was the ultimate test of a man's character. It required the patience of a saint and the steady hand of a surgeon. You'd stand there with a tiny screw and a thin piece of metal trying to hit a gap of exactly .016 inches while the mosquitoes ate your neck and the sun went down. It was frustrating, it was filthy, and I loved every minute of it. The electronic coup, the death of the gap. In the mid-1970s, the industry decided that humans were too unreliable for such delicate work. They introduced electronic ignition. The points were replaced by sensors that didn't wear out, didn't need adjusting, and didn't care about the humidity. Suddenly, the tune-up changed. You no longer adjusted anything, you simply replaced things. The spark plug remained, that stubborn porcelain finger that actually delivers the fire. But the brain controlling it had moved from a mechanical gear to a silent, unfeeling electronic control unit, ECU. The black box and the silicon wall. By the 1990s, the transformation was complete. The engine bay, once a wide-open landscape of accessible bolts and understandable tubes, became a black box. It was covered in plastic shields and crisscrossed with a nervous system of wires that looked like a bowl of Technicolor spaghetti. The weekend mechanic was the primary casualty of this progress. The old way. If the car didn't start, you checked for spark, you checked for fuel, and you hit it with a wrench. Usually, it worked. The new way. If the car doesn't start, a sensor you didn't know existed has sent a signal to a computer you can't see, which has decided to lock out the ignition because the atmospheric pressure in the spare tire is slightly too low. The loss of the mechanical soul. We have traded the tactile for the invisible. Modern cars are infinitely more reliable. They start in the freezing cold of an Iowa winter without a single cough, and they run for 100,000 miles without ever needing a screwdriver turned. But we've lost the conversation. You no longer know your car by the way the points click or the way the carburetor whistles. You just operate the interface. You are no longer the car's partner. You are its user. Twain's Audit of the Spark. Technology has a habit of making life easier by making it more mysterious. In my day, if a machine broke, you could see where the metal had failed. Now, when a car dies, it does so with a digital shrug. The weekend mechanic has been replaced by the software update. I suppose it's better for the hands, but it's a tragedy for the soul. There was a certain dignity in being covered in oil on a Saturday afternoon, knowing exactly why your world was moving. Now, we just trust the silicon and hope the ghost in the machine is in a good mood. Chapter 18, The Fuel Injection Coup, Precision via the Squirt Gun. By the mid-1980s, the carburetor, that temperamental brass lung we discussed in Chapter 11, was coughing its last oily breath. It had served us well, or at least it had served us with a great deal of drama, but the world had become a place of standards and emissions and fuel economy. The carburetor was a blunt instrument. It was a bucket with a hole in it, held over a hurricane. It worked, but it was messy. The future demanded something more surgical. It demanded the fuel injector. The mechanical squirt gun. If a carburetor is a slow-motion leak, a fuel injector is a high-pressure squirt gun. Instead of relying on the sigh of a vacuum to pull gas into the engine, we decided to simply point a nozzle at the cylinder and blast the fuel in under immense pressure. This changed everything. The atomization. Instead of large, lazy droplets of gasoline, the injector creates a mist so fine it looks like a ghost's breath. The timing. A carburetor is always on. A fuel injector is a stutterer. It opens and closes hundreds of times a second, delivering exactly the amount of fuel needed for that specific heartbeat of the engine. Fuel injection is the mechanical equivalent of a mother who insists on cutting your steak into exactly 42 identical pieces before letting you take a bite. It is precise, it is efficient, and it completely removes the joy of the big gulp. The rise of the spies. Sensors. To make this squirt gun work, the engine needed a nervous system. We covered the engine in sensors, tiny mechanical spies that report back to a central brain called the ECU, Electronic Control Unit. The oxygen sensor sits in the exhaust and smells the smoke to see if the engine is being too greedy with the gas. The mass airflow, MAF, sensor measures exactly how many molecules of air are coming in, so the computer can do the math in real time. The crankshaft position sensor tells the computer exactly where the pistons are so it doesn't spray the fuel at the back of a closed door. The death of the warm-up. The most profound cultural change brought by the fuel injection coup was the death of the morning ritual. In the era of the carburetor, starting a car in an Iowa January was a 30-minute negotiation involving a choke knob, 3 pumps of the pedal, a short prayer, and a period of idling, where you sat in the driveway watching the exhaust turn into a small, localized cloud of smog. With fuel injection, you simply turn the key, or heaven forbid, push a button, and the computer handles the rest. It knows it's cold. It knows it's Monday. It doesn't care. It sprays a little extra, adjusts the idle, and you are moving before you've even buckled your seatbelt. The invisible wall. The downside, of course, is that the engine has become a sealed tomb. In 1955, you could look at a Chevy engine and see the gas dripping into the throat of the carburetor. You could see the problem. In 2026, if a fuel injector fails, it does so silently. There is no smell of gas, no visible leak. There is only a small glowing yellow light on your dashboard, the check engine light, which is the car's way of saying, something is wrong, but I'm not going to tell you what it is unless you pay a man $80 to plug a laptop into my nervous system. Twain's Audit of the Injection. We have traded the mechanical soul for digital perfection. A fuel-injected engine is a marvel of efficiency, capable of running for a decade without a single hiccup. But it is also a machine that has forgotten how to be human. It doesn't have good days and bad days. It doesn't have a personality that requires a specific touch on the pedal. It is a servant that never complains, until the moment it dies completely. We've gained a great deal of reliability, but I can't help but miss the days when you could solve a fuel problem with a firm tap from a screwdriver and a stern look. Chapter 19. The Oil Crisis Pivot. The Day the Dinosaurs Ran Out of Juice. By the early 1970s, the American automobile had reached a state of evolutionary bloat that would have made a prehistoric sloth look positively athletic. Detroit was producing land yachts, vehicles so large they required their own zip codes and consumed gasoline with the frantic desperation of a man parched in the Sahara. We were convinced that luxury was measured by the acreage of your hood and the number of ashtrays in the armrests. Then, in 1973, the world's fuel supply decided to go on strike. The OPEC oil embargo hit the United States like a bucket of cold water to a sleeping drunk. Suddenly, the freedom of the road was restricted to even-numbered days, and the open highway was replaced by a 3-hour crawl in a gas line that stretched into the next county. The land yacht hits the iceberg. Before the crisis, a car like the Cadillac Eldorado was considered the pinnacle of success. It was 19 feet of steel, chrome, and brougham leather, powered by an 8.2-liter V8 engine that produced roughly the same amount of power as a modern blender, but used enough fuel to launch a moon rocket. The American car of 1972 was not a vehicle. It was a mobile statement of geological defiance. It was built as if the supply of oil were as infinite as human stupidity. When the pumps ran dry, these magnificent catastrophes became the world's most expensive driveway ornaments. You couldn't drive them, you couldn't sell them, and you certainly couldn't park them in anything smaller than a regional airport. The Great Downsizing, a study in panic. Detroit's reaction to the crisis was a mixture of denial and frantic, poorly planned surgery. They realized they had to make cars smaller, but they didn't quite know how to make them better. This led to the malaise era, a decade of automotive history that most designers would prefer to bury in a deep, unmarked grave. They took their massive engines and choked them with primitive smog pumps and catalytic converters to meet new regulations. The result was a car that was just as heavy as before, but had the acceleration of a heavily sedated turtle. Then came the subcompacts. To compete with the thrifty Japanese imports, Detroit gave us the Ford Pinto and the Chevy Vega. These were cars designed by accountants who had been told to save a nickel on every bolt. The Pinto famously had a fuel tank that would rupture if a butterfly sneezed on the rear bumper, and the Vega's engine had a tendency to dissolve if it encountered a humid afternoon. The death of the full-size dream. The oil crisis pivot was the moment we realized that the Earth is a finite ballroom, and we had been dancing way too close to the edge. We learned new words: miles per gallon, aerodynamics, and four-cylinder. For the first time, economy wasn't just for people who couldn't afford a real car. It was a survival strategy. We traded the bench seat for the bucket seat, the chrome for the plastic, and the roar for a high-pitched whine. We had been evicted from the Garden of Eden, and the gate was locked by a man in a safari shirt holding a no-gas sign. Twain's Audit of the Pivot. There is nothing like a shortage of a vital resource to clarify the mind. For 50 years, we treated gasoline as if it were as common as spit. Then, for one long, miserable winter, it became as precious as holy water. We suddenly discovered that we didn't actually need a car that could house a family of 6 and a grand piano. We found that a small, sensible box could get us to work just as well, provided we didn't mind losing our dignity every time we merged onto the interstate. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. The road doesn't care how big your engine is if the tank is empty. Chapter 20. The Korean Surge, from the bargain bin to the podium. If the Japanese arrival in the 1970s was a polite knock on the door, the Korean entry into the automotive world was more like someone trying to sell you a gold watch out of a trench coat in a dark alley. In the mid-1980s, a company called Hyundai arrived in America with a car called the Excel. It was a name that promised a level of performance the vehicle itself seemed entirely uninterested in achieving. At the time, the Excel was the disposable razor of the automotive world. It was cheap, it was small, and it had a build quality that suggested it was held together by nothing more than optimistic thoughts and a very light application of Elmer's glue. The era of the disposable car. In 1986, you could buy a brand new Hyundai Excel for $4,995. To put that in perspective, that's roughly what a modern driver spends on a single set of tires and a particularly aggressive car wash. The early Korean cars were a marvel of economic desperation. They were purchased by people who had run out of other options: students, poets, and those whose credit scores resembled the temperature of a brisk autumn morning in Bettendorf. Driving one was an act of faith. You didn't own a 1988 Hyundai, you merely cohabited with it until the transmission decided it wanted to see other people. For a decade, Korea was the punchline of the industry. They were the new kids who couldn't quite get the hang of the choreography. The 100,000-mile gamble. Then, in 1998, Hyundai did something that made the rest of the industry stop laughing and start sweating. They introduced America's Best Warranty, 10 years or 100,000 miles of powertrain coverage. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. They were essentially saying to the public, "We know you think our cars are made of papier-mâché, so we're going to bet our entire company's future on the fact that they aren't." Feature: the old Hyundai, 1986. The new Hyundai/Kia, 2026. Build quality, questionable. Benchmark, design. Generic shoebox. Spacecraft chic, reputation. Bargain bin, tech leader, warranty, hope for the best, 10 years of peace. The design revolution, hiring the enemy. Realizing that reliability is boring unless it looks expensive, the Koreans began a systematic talent raid on the European elite. They hired the man who designed the Audi TT, Peter Schreier, and the man who ran BMW's M division, Albert Biermann. Suddenly, Kia and Hyundai stopped looking like appliances and started looking like artifacts. They replaced the tiger nose with aggressive LEDs and sleek aerodynamic silhouettes that made the aging Japanese and American giants look like they were still wearing their father's hand-me-down suits. The EV leapfrog. As we stand here in 2026, the irony is complete. The companies that once built the cheapest gas burners on the planet are now leading the charge into the electric future. While the legacy makers were busy arguing about how to transition their old factories, the Koreans simply built new ones. The Ioniq and EV6 series aren't just good for a Korean car. They are currently the benchmark for how a modern electric vehicle should behave. Fast, efficient, and capable of charging while you're still deciding which snack to buy at the rest stop. Twain's Audit of the Surge. The Korean story is a testament to the power of the long game. They were willing to be the laughingstock of the road for 20 years just so they could be the kings of the highway for the next 50. It is a terrifying display of industrial patience. They've proven that in the world of the automobile, it doesn't matter how you start the race. It only matters how much of a warranty you're willing to offer the man behind the wheel. We've gone from the joke of the lot to the car you actually want. And I, for one, find that level of transformation slightly suspicious. I keep looking for the Elmer's glue, but all I find is silicon and high-tensile steel. Chapter 21, The Forgotten Electric Dawn, the Silent Majority of 1910. It is a common delusion among the modern tech bros of Silicon Valley that they invented the electric vehicle. They speak of the EV revolution as if it were a fresh revelation delivered from a mountaintop, rather than a recycled idea from the days when men still wore top hats to buy a loaf of bread. In the year 1900, if you stood on a street corner in New York or Chicago, the automobile was a three-way civil war. 1/3 of the cars were steam-powered, the hissing kettles we discussed in Chapter 7. 1/3 were gasoline, the noisy, oily devil wagons. And a full 1/3 were electric, the doctor's carriage. The early electric vehicle, EV, was the preferred transport of the civilized classes. It didn't smell like a refinery fire, it didn't vibrate your fillings loose, and, most importantly, it didn't require you to possess the upper body strength of a dock worker just to get it started. The electric car was the quiet American of its day. It was marketed heavily to women and physicians, two groups who generally preferred to arrive at their destinations without being covered in grease or having their wrists broken by a recalcitrant hand crank. If you were a doctor in a place like Bettendorf, Iowa, heading out for a midnight house call in the dead of winter, you didn't want to spend 20 minutes fighting a frozen gasoline engine. You wanted to flip a switch and glide. The lead-acid anchor. The technology of 1910 was remarkably similar to the technology of 2010, albeit with more wood and less plastic. The heart of the machine was the lead-acid battery. It was a simple, heavy, and deeply inefficient way to store energy. To get a decent range, you had to pack the car with hundreds of pounds of lead plates soaking in jars of sulfuric acid. It made the cars incredibly heavy and limited their top speed to about 20 miles per hour. This was perfectly fine for city work, but the moment you wanted to visit your cousin in the next county, the electric car became a very handsome, very stationary piece of sculpture. The assassin, the electric starter. So, what killed the first electric era? It wasn't the battery, and it wasn't the oil companies. It was a small, unassuming device invented by Charles Kettering in 1912, the electric starter. Before the starter, a gasoline car was a physical hazard. You had to stand in front of the car and manually crank the engine to life. If the engine kicked back, the crank handle would spin with enough force to shatter your radius and ulna. The electric starter removed the danger and the sweat from the gasoline engine. Suddenly, the devil wagon was just as easy to start as the electric carriage, but it had 10 times the range and could be recharged in 5 minutes with a bucket of fuel. The electric car, with its limited range and its overnight charging requirements, was relegated to the dustbin of history. The century-long nap. For the next 100 years, the electric car was a punchline. It was seen as a golf cart or a science project. We became a civilization addicted to the bang of the piston, forgetting that for a brief moment at the turn of the century, we had a silent, clean alternative that we traded away for a bit of extra speed and the convenience of the pump. Twain's audit of the electric dawn. History is not a straight line. It is a series of circles. We spent a century perfecting the explosion only to realize that the quiet carriage we abandoned in 1910 was the right idea all along. We've spent billions of dollars to get back to where we started, proving that humanity is a species that insists on taking the most expensive and loudest route possible to reach a conclusion that was already sitting in the driveway. We didn't evolve into EVs. We finally just remembered how to use them. Chapter 22, The Hybrid Bridge, Having Your Cake and Burning It Too. By the late 1990s, the automotive industry was suffering from a profound identity crisis. On one hand, we had the SUV craze, where the American public decided that the best way to drop a child off at soccer practice was in a 3-ton armored box designed for traversing the Rubicon Trail. On the other hand, a small, quiet voice in Japan was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't be setting the atmosphere on fire quite so aggressively. The result was the hybrid, a mechanical compromise that attempted to marry the range of a gasoline engine with the conscience of an electric motor. It was the peace treaty of the road. The Prius, the Hollywood darling of the humble brag. In 1997, Toyota released the Prius. It was a car that looked like a sensible shoe and had the personality of a lukewarm glass of water. It was not fast. It was not beautiful. But it was important. The Prius became the first car in history to be bought primarily as a moral statement. Suddenly, celebrities who usually traveled in private jets were pulling up to the Oscars in a small, snub-nosed Toyota. It was the ultimate green badge of honor. The Prius was the first vehicle designed specifically to make the driver feel superior to everyone else in the traffic jam. It didn't just save gas, it emitted a palpable cloud of smug. You could tell a Prius driver by the way they stared at the fuel gauge with the intensity of a monk contemplating a holy relic. The technology of the middle way. A hybrid is essentially a car with two hearts, an internal combustion engine and an electric motor. They are joined together by a piece of mechanical genius called a power split device, a planetary gear set that decides which heart should be beating at any given moment. Low speed. The car glides on silent electric wings. High speed. The gasoline engine kicks in to provide the oomph needed for the interstate. The handshake. When you brake, the motor turns into a generator, sucking the kinetic energy out of your momentum and shoving it back into the battery. Regenerative braking, getting something for nothing. The most clever part of the hybrid was regenerative braking. For 100 years, every time you hit the brakes, you were essentially turning gasoline into heat and throwing it away. The hybrid decided that was a waste of perfectly good motion. By using the electric motor to slow the car down, we could capture that energy and store it for later. It was the first time in history that stopping actually helped you go. Feature: conventional gas car, hybrid electric, HEV. Fuel source: 100% gasoline. Gasoline plus recycled energy. Braking: waste, heat, recovery, electricity. City miles per gallon. Poor, idling. Excellent, EV mode. Complexity, high. Good luck repairing it yourself. The bridge to tomorrow. The hybrid was never intended to be the final destination. It was the gateway drug for the electric revolution. It taught a generation of drivers that a car could be quiet. It taught them that they didn't need to fear a battery, and it proved that you could achieve 50 miles per gallon without having to push the car yourself. It was a strange, transitional era, a bit like a centaur, half beast and half human. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed us to keep our gas stations while flirting with the plug. Twain's audit of the hybrid. The hybrid is the mechanical equivalent of a man who claims to be a vegetarian, but keeps a secret stash of bacon in his nightstand. It's a car that wants to be seen doing the right thing, while still keeping its options open in case it needs to drive to the next state without stopping. It is a masterpiece of indecision. We've managed to complicate the engine by doubling its parts, all so we can feel a little less guilty about the fact that we still can't stop moving. It's a bridge to the future, certainly, but it's a bridge with a tailpipe. And that tells you everything you need to know about the human heart. Chapter 23. The Lithium Leap, the battery that finally stayed awake. For 100 years, the electric car was the sleeping beauty of the automotive world, tucked away in a glass coffin of lead-acid batteries and broken promises. We've already discussed how the electric starter killed the first EV era in 1912, but the real culprit was the energy density problem. To put it in terms a 19th century riverboat pilot would understand, a gallon of gasoline is a dense, volatile miracle. It contains about 33 kilowatt-hours of energy, the equivalent of a very small, very angry sun. To get that same amount of push from a lead-acid battery in 1910, you needed a pile of lead that weighed as much as a prize-winning steer. Then came lithium. The Silicon Valley insurgency. The lithium leap didn't start in Detroit or Stuttgart. It started in a land of hoodies and disruption called Silicon Valley. A group of engineers, led by a man who seems to view the Earth as a temporary parking spot before moving to Mars, realized that the batteries in your laptop were actually better than the batteries in your car. They took thousands of tiny cylindrical lithium-ion cells, the kind that power your flashlight, and wired them together into a massive, heavy floorboard. They didn't build a car around an engine, they built a skateboard. The modern EV is less of a carriage and more of a very fast, very heavy smartphone with wheels. It doesn't have a soul in the traditional sense of gears and grease. It has a firmware version. When your car's performance can be improved by a software update while you sleep, you're no longer a driver. You're a beta tester for a multi-billion-dollar laboratory. The chemistry of the quiet revolution. The magic of the lithium-ion battery lies in its ability to move ions back and forth through a liquid electrolyte without throwing a tantrum. The charge. You shove the ions into the anode, the storage closet. The discharge. The ions rush toward the cathode, creating a flow of electrons that turns your motor. Lithium is the lightest metal on the periodic table, and it is incredibly greedy for electrons. This allows for an energy density that finally, after a century of waiting, allows a car to travel 300 miles on a single charge. It turns out that if you make a battery light enough and powerful enough, you can finally outrun the ghost of the gasoline pump. The range anxiety epidemic. With the lithium leap came a new, uniquely modern psychological disorder, range anxiety. In a gasoline car, if you run low on fuel, you pull into one of the 10,000 stations that litter the landscape like mechanical toadstools, spend 5 minutes, and you're off. In an EV, the refuel is a commitment. You have to find a supercharger, plug in, and wait. Range anxiety is the feeling a man gets when he realizes his car has 10% battery left and the nearest charger is 20 miles away and currently being occupied by a man who is napping while his car slowly sips electrons. It is the only time in history where a driver will turn off the air conditioning in a 100-degree heat wave just to ensure they can make it to a parking lot in Des Moines. The death of the grill. The most visible sign of the lithium leap is the disappearance of the grill. For a century, the front of a car was defined by a gaping maw designed to suck in air to cool the internal explosions. An EV doesn't explode. It hums. It doesn't need a mouth. Modern EVs have faces that are smooth, blank, and slightly unnerving, like a person who has had too much Botox and forgotten how to smile. It's aerodynamic, yes, but it's a far cry from the chrome-toothed snarl of a 1957 Chevy. Twain's audit of the lithium era. We have finally achieved the silent, clean dream of 1910, but we've done it by turning the automobile into a digital appliance. There is no tinkering with a lithium battery. If you poke it with a screwdriver, you don't fix it. You create a chemical fire that can be seen from space. We've traded the mechanical partnership for electronic convenience. It's faster, it's cleaner, and it's undeniably impressive. But I can't help but feel that when a car's greatest feature is its autopilot, we've finally admitted that we're bored with the act of driving altogether. Chapter 24. The Silicon Valley Disruptors. The Tablet on Wheels. By the second decade of the 21st century, the automotive industry realized it had a problem. It was still thinking in terms of steel and rubber, while the rest of the world had moved on to silicon and data. The disruption didn't come from a new kind of engine, but from a new kind of philosophy. The car was no longer a machine you owned. It was a software-defined vehicle, SDV, essentially a very large, very heavy smartphone that occasionally allows you to steer it. The over-the-air OTA revolution. For 100 years, when you bought a car, that car stayed exactly the same until the day it was towed to the scrapyard. If it had a bug, you went to the dealer. If it lacked a feature, you bought a newer model. The Silicon Valley approach changed that. By connecting the car to the internet, manufacturers could push updates while you slept. The good, your car might actually get better over time. It could gain range, better braking, or a new fart mode for the turn signals. The bad, the manufacturer can also take things away or recalibrate your car's performance without your consent. We have reached a point where the user agreement is more important than the owner's manual. You don't just start a modern car, you log into it. And like all software, it is subject to the whims of a programmer in a cubicle 3,000 miles away, who has decided that your dashboard should now look like a neon-lit arcade game. The rise of the microtransaction. This is perhaps the most audacious move in the history of the road. Manufacturers realize that if the car is controlled by software, they can put features in the car and then lock them behind a paywall. We are entering the era of the automotive subscription. You've already paid for the hardware. The heaters are in the seats. The wires are in the steering wheel. But if you want them to actually warm up on a freezing morning in Iowa, you have to pay a monthly fee. Feature, the old way. The subscription way. Heated seats. You bought the cold weather package. $18 per month. Winter only, if you're lucky. Horsepower. You bought the bigger engine. Software unlock for an extra $50 per year. Navigation. You bought a map or a GPS unit. Monthly data plan, or the screen goes dark. The car as a data harvester. Your car is no longer just a way to get to work. It is a rolling surveillance device. It tracks where you go, how fast you drive, how hard you brake, and, in some cases, what music you're listening to. This data is the new oil, sold to insurance companies and advertisers who are very interested in why you stop at that specific donut shop every Tuesday at 7 a.m. The disruptors prove that you don't make money by selling a car once. You make money by keeping the driver in a state of perpetual digital debt. Twain's Audit of the Digital Sled. The disruption of the modern car is really just a fancy word for taking away the title. We used to own our machines. Now we merely subscribe to them. We've traded the grease-stained hands of the mechanic for the polished glass screen of the technician. It is an era of immense convenience and zero privacy. I miss the days when a car's only data was the mud on its fenders and the smell of old leather. Now, the car knows more about my destination than I do, and it's likely already sent my credit card number to a satellite in the name of user experience. Chapter 25. The Autonomous Horizon. The car that doesn't need you. We have reached the final frontier of the road, the moment where humanity, after 5,000 years of steering, whipping, and pedaling, finally decides to sit in the back seat and let a collection of silicon chips and laser beams handle the commute. We are transitioning from the age of the driver to the age of the passenger, even when we are the only ones in the vehicle. The dream is simple: A world without traffic jams, without road rage, and most importantly, a world without the 94% of accidents caused by human fallibility. We are trying to build a machine that is smarter, faster, and more attentive than a distracted human with a smartphone in one hand and a latte in the other. The sensor suite, the machine's nervous system. To drive itself, a car needs to see the world more clearly than we do. It uses a three-pronged approach to perception: LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a spinning laser on the roof that pulses millions of times a second, creating a perfect 360 degrees, 3D point cloud of everything within 300 yards. Radar, excellent for seeing through fog, rain, or snow, and for judging the exact speed of the car in front of you. Computer vision, high-resolution cameras that read stop signs, traffic lights, and the subtle body language of a cyclist who is about to make a sudden left turn. The levels of human obsolescence. The industry uses a standardized scale, the SAE levels of autonomy, to measure exactly how much of the driving a human actually has to do. Level, name, description. Level 1, driver assistance. The car helps with one thing, like cruise control. Level 2, partial automation. The car handles steering and speed, but you must keep your eyes on the road. Level 3, conditional automation. The car drives, but you must be ready to take over when it gets confused. Level 4, high automation. The car can drive itself completely in specific areas, like a geo-fenced city. Level 5, full automation. No steering wheel, no pedals. The car can go anywhere a human can in any weather. The ethical algorithm, the trolley problem. As we move toward level 5, we encounter a problem that no mechanic can fix: ethics. If an autonomous car finds itself in a situation where a crash is unavoidable, say a choice between hitting a group of schoolchildren or swerving into a concrete wall and killing its own passenger, who does it choose? We are forcing programmers to write code for the trolley problem, turning a split-second human tragedy into a premeditated mathematical calculation. We are attempting to teach a machine morality before we've even finished teaching it how to navigate a roundabout in a snowstorm. It is a terrifying prospect. A car that doesn't just know the way to your office, but has also already decided how much your life is worth compared to a busload of tourists. The end of the road? If the autonomous horizon is fully realized, the very nature of the road changes. We won't own cars, we will summon robo-taxis. The garage in your house will become a spare bedroom. The parking lots that currently consume 30% of our city centers will become parks. The road will return to being what it was during the Roman era: a utility, a flow of goods and people moving with quiet, algorithmic precision. The joy of the open road, the roar of the engine, the feel of the wheel, the smell of the gasoline will become a hobby, something you do on a specialized track, much like we still ride horses today for fun, but never to get to the grocery store. Twain's final audit. And so, the circle is complete. We began with a man walking behind a donkey, and we end with a man sitting in a silent leather-lined box while a computer does the walking for him. We have spent centuries trying to find a faster way to get there, only to realize that There is no longer a destination, but merely a data point. The automobile gave us the greatest freedom in human history, the freedom to move ourselves through space. We are now in the process of trading that freedom for the convenience of being transported. It is a noble, efficient, and utterly boring conclusion to the greatest adventure of the modern age. I'll keep my steamboat, thank you very much. At least there, I knew which way the current was pulling me. This has been Mark Twain. I've enjoyed the ride. I hope you did too. System shut down 0%. System shut down 25%. System shut down 75%. Offline.